Building your breakthrough mindset, from shame to strategic action. Embracing self-compassion, releasing the burden of shame. Understanding self-compassion. When my college project manager missed her quarterly report deadline for the third time in 6 months, she sent herself into a spiral of self-recrimination that lasted weeks. She called herself lazy, undisciplined, and fundamentally broken, language she would never direct toward any team member who struggled with similar challenges. This discrepancy reveals something profound about how we treat ourselves versus how we treat others. Self-compassion isn't self-indulgence or making excuses. It's treating yourself with the same reasonable kindness you'd extend to a colleague facing difficulty. When someone on your team misses a deadline, you don't berate them endlessly. You assess what happened, identify obstacles, and work together on solutions. You recognize their humanity. Yet, when you procrastinate, the internal dialogue becomes brutal, judgmental, dismissive. This harsh self-criticism creates a destructive loop. Shame triggers avoidance. Avoidance deepens procrastination. Procrastination amplifies shame. Self-criticism operates under the false premise that punishment motivates change. In reality, research consistently shows that self-compassion, not self-flagellation, predicts sustained behavioral improvement. Bryans and Chen, 2012, Sirois, 2019. When you approach your procrastination with curiosity rather than condemnation, you create the psychological safety necessary to examine what's actually happening beneath the delay. You stop defending against your own attacks and start problem-solving instead. The shift begins with recognizing that procrastination isn't a character flaw requiring punishment. It's a challenge requiring understanding. Breaking the shame cycle. Shame doesn't just accompany procrastination, it feeds it, creating a vicious cycle that becomes harder to break with each turn. When you delay a task, shame whispers that you're lazy, undisciplined, or fundamentally flawed. Then, to escape that painful narrative, you avoid the task even more. The very shame that stems from procrastination becomes the reason you can't move forward. This cycle operates largely beneath conscious awareness, making it particularly insidious. You might not even recognize the harsh judgment you're directing at yourself. It simply feels like truth. Over my years managing large teams, I witnessed this pattern repeatedly. High performers paralyzed not by lack of skill, but by an internal critic so severe that attempting a task felt like risking confirmation of their worst fears about themselves. I've been there myself, staring at a project proposal while my mind catalogued every past failure as evidence of inevitable disappointment. The shame didn't motivate me, it immobilized me. Breaking this cycle requires conscious self-awareness, the ability to catch shame in the act and name it for what it is. When you notice thoughts like, "I always mess this up," or "I'm such a failure," pause. These aren't objective assessments, they're shame speaking. Simply recognizing this distinction creates space between you and the emotion, weakening its grip. Self-acceptance becomes the antidote. This doesn't mean excusing procrastination or abandoning accountability. It means acknowledging that you're human, that delay happens, and that one delayed task doesn't define your worth or capability. Replace "I'm a procrastinator" with "I procrastinated on this specific task." Notice the difference? One is an identity, the other is a behavior, and behaviors can change. Practice replacing negative self-talk with supportive inner dialogue. When shame arises, respond as you would to a trusted colleague facing the same struggle, with understanding, encouragement, and practical guidance rather than condemnation. Practicing self-compassion daily. Research from self-compassion expert Dr. Kristen Neff reveals that people who treat themselves with kindness during setbacks recover faster, demonstrate greater resilience, and perform better than those who rely on harsh self-criticism. The data is unambiguous. Shame doesn't motivate sustainable change. Compassion does. In professional environments, teams function most effectively when mistakes are met with curiosity and a focus on learning, rather than condemnation. This same principle applies internally. Every time you catch yourself in self-judgment, you face a choice. Reinforce the shame loop or interrupt it. That interruption doesn't happen through willpower alone. It requires deliberate, repeated practice until new patterns emerge. Begin with something deceptively simple. When procrastination strikes and the familiar wave of self-criticism follows, pause. Acknowledge the emotion without amplifying it. You might say to yourself, "I notice I'm feeling frustrated right now," rather than, "I'm a failure." This small shift creates psychological distance, transforming an identity statement into an observation. Daily habits matter more than grand gestures. Each morning, set an intention to observe your internal dialogue as you would a colleague's, with interest, not contempt. When you catch harsh self-talk, ask what you would say to a trusted friend facing the same situation. Write it down if it helps. This isn't about hollow affirmations. It's about realistic, empathetic redirection. Another practical tool is the compassion break. When overwhelmed by a task you've delayed, stop for 60 seconds. Place one hand over your heart, feel your breath, and silently acknowledge that struggle is part of being human. This isn't weakness, it's strategic self-regulation that reduces cortisol and improves decision-making. Cultivating self-compassion transforms procrastination from a character flaw into a signal worth investigating. What need isn't being met? What fear is driving avoidance? These questions, asked with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, unlock pathways to sustainable change that shame never could. Reframing procrastination. From flaw to solvable challenge. Understanding the flaw fallacy. Most professionals believe procrastination reveals something broken inside them. When you delay that presentation, ignore urgent emails, or spend hours reorganizing files instead of tackling real work, the explanation feels obvious. You lack discipline. You're fundamentally flawed in some essential way that more capable people aren't. This interpretation, pervasive as it is, misses what's actually happening. Procrastination isn't a character defect. It's your nervous system responding to perceived threat. When facing anxiety-triggering work, your brain doesn't distinguish between psychological discomfort and physical danger. The same neural pathways activate whether you're confronting a hostile predator or a performance review. Your limbic system prioritizes immediate relief over strategic thinking, triggering avoidance that feels irresistible because, neurologically, it is. Research consistently shows that procrastination is often an emotion-focused coping strategy. Individuals may delay critical presentations or challenging reports not due to a lack of competence, but because these tasks trigger feelings of anxiety, fear of judgment, or even boredom. As psychologists Timothy Feichel and Fuskia Siroa emphasize, the momentary relief gained by avoiding such tasks activates the brain's reward system, reinforcing the behavior. This avoidance, far from being laziness, serves as a threat response to perceived emotional discomfort, prioritizing immediate mood repair over task completion. The flaw fallacy collapses when you examine procrastination's triggers. Fear of failure, perfectionism, and unclear success criteria generate delay regardless of moral character. A confident professional procrastinates on ambiguous projects. A diligent worker avoids tasks where standards feel impossibly high. These patterns reflect normal human psychology, confronting specific conditions, not permanent personality defects. Understanding this distinction changes everything. When procrastination signals this situation triggers protective responses rather than you're inherently defective, you can investigate what's actually driving avoidance. What need isn't being met? What fear needs addressing? The behavior remains problematic, but it becomes solvable, a challenge requiring strategy, not evidence of your unworthiness. Identifying underlying causes. Stanford researcher Kelly McGonigal spent years documenting a revealing pattern among chronically stressed individuals. Those who interpreted their physical stress responses as harmful experienced worse health outcomes than equally stressed people who reframed those same sensations as their body mobilizing energy. McGonigal, 2015. The procrastination parallel is striking. When you delay a crucial task, your interpretation of that delay fundamentally shapes what happens next. Consider what happens in your mind when you postpone an important deadline. Your heart rate increases. Your stomach tightens. These physical sensations trigger an internal narrative. I'm not cut out for this. Or, here I go again, failing like always. This self-critical interpretation activates a threat response far more intense than the task itself ever could. Your brain perceives the delay as evidence of personal deficiency rather than what it actually represents. A complex interaction of emotional triggers, situational pressures, and psychological patterns. The emotional component alone carries significant weight. Anxiety about performance, fear of judgment, overwhelm from competing priorities. These feelings don't signal weakness. They signal your brain attempting to protect you from perceived danger, even when that danger is merely the discomfort of challenging work. Understanding this protective mechanism transforms procrastination from a character flaw into a solvable psychological challenge. Situational factors compound these emotional responses. An unclear task description, insufficient resources, conflicting demands on your time, or even poor lighting in your workspace can all contribute to delay. These external conditions interact with your internal state, creating a perfect storm that has nothing to do with your worth or capability. When you recognize procrastination as the convergence of these multiple influences rather than a personal failing, you gain the power to address each component strategically. The delay becomes information, data about what needs to change in your approach, your environment, or your understanding of the task itself. Redefining success and failure. Most of us carry a deep-seated belief that success and failure mark the end of something. A project completed, a goal achieved, a dream abandoned. This binary thinking traps us in a dangerous cycle where every misstep feels like a verdict on our character, every delay like evidence of some fundamental flaw. But what if we've been looking at this all wrong? Success and failure are not destinations. They're waypoints on a continuous journey of learning and adaptation. When I led large-scale renewable energy projects, the most valuable lessons never came from flawless execution. They emerged from the moments when systems failed, timelines slipped, and carefully laid plans collapsed under the weight of unforeseen challenges. Each setback taught me something no success ever could. How to adapt, how to reassess, how to build better strategies for the next attempt. The growth mindset transforms how we perceive every outcome. Instead of asking, did I succeed or fail? We learn to ask, what did this teach me? This shift in perspective dissolves the fear of failure that keeps us frozen in procrastination. When failure becomes feedback rather than condemnation, we no longer need to avoid difficult tasks to protect our self-image. We can engage with them as experiments, gathering data about what works and what doesn't. Consider your most recent procrastination episode. What were you actually avoiding? The task itself, or the possibility of not performing perfectly? The fear of failure often masquerades as simple delay, but underneath lies a protective mechanism trying to shield you from judgment. By reframing setbacks as essential learning opportunities, you remove the stakes that make procrastination feel safer than action. This isn't about celebrating failure or lowering standards. It's about recognizing that meaningful progress requires iteration, multiple attempts, adjustments, and refinements. When you internalize this truth, procrastination loses its primary fuel. The belief that anything less than perfect execution represents personal inadequacy. Developing a strategic approach. Building a strategy to dismantle procrastination requires translating insight into systematic action. Start by identifying one task you've been avoiding. Don't create an inventory of everything you should be doing. That path leads straight back to overwhelm. Write down exactly what you'll do, when you'll do it, and for how long. Not work on the presentation, but write the opening paragraph of the Q3 presentation at 9 a.m. Tuesday for 15 minutes. This specificity, often termed implementation intentions in psychological research, bypasses the decision-making process that procrastination exploits, enhancing goal achievement. When the time comes, you're not debating whether to start or what starting means. You already know. Gollwitzer and Brandstetter, 1997. Now build your feedback loop. After each attempt, record 3 things: what actually happened, what you felt before and during the work, and what you'll adjust next time. This isn't journaling for catharsis, it's data collection. Over 7 to 14 days, patterns emerge that your conscious mind never noticed. Particular times when resistance peaks, specific environments that amplify avoidance, emotional states that predict delay. Use this intelligence to redesign your approach. If anxiety spikes when tasks feel open-ended, break them into smaller segments with clear stopping points. If certain locations trigger avoidance, change your workspace. If perfectionism freezes you at the beginning, commit to producing deliberately imperfect first drafts. Each cycle of attempt, observe, adjust strengthens your capacity to work with your actual psychological reality rather than the idealized version where willpower conquers all. The crucial element most people miss: predetermined recovery protocols. Not if you skip a session, but when. Decide now what you'll do after a setback. Return to the same task the next scheduled time. No makeup sessions, no self-punishment. This removes the catastrophic thinking that turns one missed attempt into total collapse. Expect this process to feel awkward and incomplete. That's the point. You're building tolerance for imperfect action, which is the only antidote to procrastination's demand for perfect conditions that never arrive. Track your small completions, not because they're impressive, but because they're evidence that the system works when you're willing to iterate, rather than abandon ship at the first difficulty. Strategic patience. Commitment to the non-linear journey. Embracing non-linear progress. Progress toward overcoming procrastination doesn't follow the trajectory you've been conditioned to expect. Map your actual pattern of forward movement using a simple visual tracker. Create a chart with vertical columns representing weeks and mark each day's level of task engagement on a scale from 0 to 5. After 3 weeks, connect the dots. What emerges isn't an upward diagonal line. It's a jagged path with peaks, valleys, and seemingly inexplicable plateaus. This exercise transforms your relationship with setbacks by making non-linearity visible and expected rather than evidence of failure. Example: graph, a visual representation of a jagged progress line with peaks, valleys, and plateaus, illustrating non-linear progress over time. When you encounter what feels like regression, a week where everything falls apart despite previous momentum, you're not losing ground. You're experiencing the natural rhythm of behavioral change. The human brain doesn't rewire itself in smooth increments. It consolidates new patterns through cycles of integration and testing. Castillo-Aguilar, 2024. Siegelman, 2024. What you interpret as backsliding is often the mind stress-testing new approaches against old defaults, determining which strategies truly serve you and which need refinement. Strategic patience means distinguishing between productive struggle and genuine misalignment. During a plateau, ask yourself one diagnostic question: am I still engaging with the process, even imperfectly? If the answer is yes, you're building something sustainable. The construction happens in the friction, not just the forward motion. I learned this managing multi-year renewable energy projects where months of preparation yielded no visible results, then suddenly converged into rapid implementation. Personal transformation follows identical principles. The foundation building phase feels slow and uncertain precisely because it's establishing infrastructure that will support lasting change. Quick fixes collapse because they skip this essential groundwork, prioritizing immediate visible results over structural integrity. Your commitment isn't measured by perfect consistency, but by your willingness to return after disruption. Each time you resume progress after a setback, you strengthen the neural pathways that support resilience itself, making the next recovery shorter and more intuitive. This is how sustainable change compounds over time. Building dedication tactics. When resistance arrives tomorrow, and it will, you now possess something fundamentally different than before. Not certainty, not immunity, but a framework for understanding what delay means and how to respond without collapsing into self-judgment. You've learned that procrastination signals unmet needs rather than character deficiencies, that progress resists linearity, and that returning after disruption builds capacity more effectively than flawless execution ever could. These aren't consolation prizes for those who can't achieve real productivity. They represent the actual architecture of sustainable transformation. Yet understanding alone won't carry you through the difficult weeks ahead. You need practical tactics that reinforce commitment when motivation fades, when the initial enthusiasm of change gives way to the grinding reality of habit formation. The strategies that follow aren't about willpower or discipline in the traditional sense. They're about creating structures that make dedication easier, more natural, more aligned with how human behavior actually changes over time. Start with incremental goals that honor where you actually are, not where you wish you were. Break down overwhelming projects into units so small they feel almost trivial. 15 minutes of focused work, one paragraph written, a single email sent. These micro-commitments bypass the paralysis that grand ambitions often trigger. More importantly, they generate momentum through completion, and completion generates confidence. Each small victory rewires your relationship with follow-through, proving that action is possible even when motivation is absent. Celebrate these victories deliberately, not with empty self-congratulation, but with genuine acknowledgement that you showed up despite the resistance. Keep a simple log of completed tasks, however minor they seem. Review it during moments of doubt. This isn't about manufacturing false positivity. It's about building evidence against the narrative that you always give up, that change is impossible for you specifically. Equally crucial is developing a personal support system that understands the non-linear nature of your journey. Share your struggles with people who won't offer quick fixes or question your commitment when setbacks occur. Accountability partners who check in regularly, not to judge your progress, but to witness your effort, can transform isolated struggle into shared experience. Sometimes, the difference between quitting and continuing is simply knowing that someone else expects to hear from you tomorrow. These tactics work together to create what psychological research calls behavioral momentum, the tendency for action to perpetuate itself once initiated. Nevin, 1992. They don't eliminate resistance or guarantee linear progress. They make the non-linear journey navigable, sustainable, ultimately transformative.